Good evening. Had a brother ask me on the way in. I thought y'all were gone already and told him no, Thursday. Trying to overlook the note of disappointment that Andy wasn't going to be teaching tonight. But he'll be taking good care of you next week, and then we'll be back before our next study in the book of Acts together. So this evening, listen to what I mean, not what I say. This evening, we're in Acts chapter 25 and verse 1. It's always been funny to me that we have Felix in Acts 24 that has a much kinder name that deals with Paul rather roughly, holding him for multiple years, hoping to receive a bribe from him. And then Festus, who has a much less kind name that seems to deal with Paul much more kindly and uprightly. But even then, we see failures in the way that Paul is treated by the system here in Acts chapter 25. So this is 2 years that Paul has been imprisoned under the care of Rome in Caesarea, and Felix is replaced as governor in the province by Festus. And we see in verse 1, 3 days after Festus arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. Now, Caesarea is more northern than is Jerusalem. Jerusalem is south relative to Caesarea. So surely Luke is a fraud here because he says that he went up to Jerusalem, right? Right? So up in elevation. And we've seen Luke consistently use that language. Still, though, this is one of those common charges that people have against Luke and the historicity of his document, that he talks about going up to Jerusalem when they're going south. And it's very clear that all the people that have those criticisms never came to Red Bowling Springs, because for us, everything was down. Whenever we'd be going to see my mom's family in Illinois, and if you're not an expert in geography, Illinois is much more north and northern than Tennessee. I'd still say we were going down to Salem, Illinois, because that's whenever you're going away from where you are, we would always say down. And we have to remember that biblical authors are human authors as well, that use language the way that people use language. And no one in any context would accuse a secular author with error here by saying that they went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea when they were going up in elevation rather than going up north. All right, so he goes up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. Verse 2, the chief priests and the leaders of the Jews presented their case against Paul to him, and they appealed, asking for a favor against Paul, that Festus summon him to Jerusalem. They were, in fact, preparing an ambush along the road to kill him. The more things change, the more things stay the same. Here they are 2 years removed, and they still have this zealous effort to kill Paul. And this is something we've seen going all the way back to Acts 22, whenever he makes his initial defense in front of the Jews at the temple, and whenever he says that he was sent to be an apostle to the Gentiles, that they say, wipe this man from the face of the earth. They have had a zeal in taking the life of Paul that is greater than the one that they showed in even killing Jesus. So much so that twice now they have been willing to risk the full wrath of Rome just to kill Paul by killing a Roman citizen in the custody of Rome by means of sabotage and subterfuge against their Roman occupiers. Okay, verse 4 though, Festus, however, answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea and that he himself was about to go there shortly. Therefore, he said, let those of you who have authority go down with me and accuse him if he has done anything wrong. So on his visit to Jerusalem, they pitched their case against Paul and want him to summon Paul. You know, Festus, while you're here, just have Paul brought on up to Jerusalem and we can deal with this problem. Now, he says he's going to go back to Caesarea. Now, whether he has any indication of what is going on here or whether he doesn't want to cede control here to move the Roman citizen out of the more Roman city of Caesarea to Jerusalem, the text does not specify for us, but in any case, after some time, he returns to Caesarea. When he had spent not more than 8 or 10 days among them, he went down to Caesarea. This is possibly a Hebraism here. That is where there's a Hebrew way of speaking that is preserved in another language. And the reason for that being that 10 days was a way that the Hebrews would say a few days. So again, there have been charges of accuracy where, in particular, Moses in the books of Genesis and Exodus would say that after 10 days, such and such happened. And people would say, oh, well, 10 days is nowhere near long enough for Abram to go from Ur down to the Negev. He would need, X number of days at least to do that. Well, 10 days is a way of Hebrew writing to say a while, but not a long while. Like I said, the way we would say a few days. No one is going to say, you said a few days, but it was actually 4. You're a liar. And it's possible here that that's what Luke is meaning when he says, when he had spent not more than 8 or 10 days among them. And it would explain some of the ambiguity there because Luke is so often very precise. All right, so he went down to Caesarea. The next day, seated at the tribunal, he commanded Paul to be brought in. When he arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him and brought many serious charges that they were not able to prove. Did you ever throw pasta at a wall to see if it would stick? It was really exciting when you're a kid. And then when you're an adult and you have to clean said wall, it becomes much less exciting. But I'm sure this is what they do in Italy, that whenever, tongue firmly in cheek, they want to see if their pasta is cooked perfectly, they throw it against the wall and perfectly cooked pasta will stick and undercooked will not. Well, that's what the Jews are doing here, that they're throwing as many accusations as they can against Paul and trying to find something that sticks, but they were unable to prove them. Then Paul made his defense, neither against the Jewish law, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I sinned in any way. But Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, replied to Paul, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem to be tried before me there on these charges? Do we see a common theme here? Well, why did Felix hold Paul in prison for 2 years? He hoped to receive a bribe from him, but he wanted to do what? Wanted to please the Jews, to do the Jews a favor. And then the Jews asked for the same from Festus and bring Paul to Jerusalem. You sure would be doing us a huge favor. And then now Festus says in verse 9, despite hearing these false accusations against Paul, says, are you willing to go to Jerusalem and be tried there? Because he wants to do the Jews a favor. Now, why were Festus and Felix so keen on getting the Jews on their good side? Well, we're 15, 20 years removed at this point from when Jerusalem is going to be leveled by Titus and Rome, because they're always a problem. So this is the political and social setting in which Paul is receiving these accusations from the Jews when they're trying to use their political pressure to get what they want done with Paul. And both Felix and Festus are in precarious positions because of Paul's standing as a Roman citizen. Much of the same thing happened with Jesus 20 or so years previous, but Jesus lacked something that Paul had. What was that? The, the Roman citizenship that made Jesus far more expendable to Pilate and to Rome to keep the Jews placated, but they couldn't do that with Paul. And Paul knows that because in verse 10, he says, I am standing at Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, even as you yourself know very well. If then I did anything wrong and am deserving of death, I am not trying to escape death. But if there is nothing to what these men accuse me of, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. And then after Festus conferred with his council, he replied, you have appealed to Caesar you will go. Now, every Roman citizen had the right to appeal to Caesar, to have their case heard before Caesar, but it was not a guaranteed right. They could make the request, but it was not guaranteed that it would be heard. Perhaps it's for this reason that, according to tradition, Paul remains in the custody of Rome for nearly half a decade from this point before he is able to go in front of Caesar. But I think the reason for Paul's appeal here is that he sees the proverbial writing on the wall, that just as it happened with Felix, that they brought false accusations against him that were unfounded and unproven, that he remained in prison for 2 years. And then now, this Festus guy has been governor for all of 2 or 3 weeks, and he's already saying, do you want to go to Jerusalem to be tried there? Because what happened the last time that he was on trial in Jerusalem? There was a mob, and he had to be rescued by Lysias because he was afraid that he was going to be torn apart in front of the Sanhedrin. So I think Paul understands that here, with the influence of the Jews, that he is not going to get a fair trial here in Jerusalem or Caesarea. But there's also something else that Jesus knows that Festus and the Jews do not. What's that? Yeah, well, that's their plan, right? And Festus certainly doesn't seem to know that, because I don't think he would open himself up to that risk. What's Paul told in Acts 23 in verse 11? That just as he had in Jerusalem, he was to testify about Jesus in Rome. And now, depending on how much we want to read into what Jesus told him there. It could be that even as he testified about Jesus in Jerusalem, so also he would testify about Jesus in Rome. But it's also plausible that Paul understood him to be saying, in the same way that you did testify about me in Jerusalem, you will, in the same way, testify about me in Rome. And how did Paul testify about Jesus in Jerusalem? As a what? As a prisoner, right? And so whether there was any more revelation specific to this between Acts 23 and Acts 25, these two intervening years when he's in the custody of Felix in Caesarea or not, we don't really know. So it could be that this was something that Paul was specifically instructed to do, or it could be that Paul believed this to be the most effective way to bring about what he had been told to do. But in any case, he is putting his life, his freedom on the line in appealing to Caesar. Now, I do want to skip ahead here a little bit to Acts chapter 26. In the very end of Acts 26, verse 32. Now, I'm going to spoil some things that come in between, but Herod Agrippa, who is the Roman puppet king of the Jews and the Idumeans, the descendant of Herod the Builder, that was Herod when Jesus was born, is wanting to come and see what this Paul is all about. And he says in verse 32, this man could have been released if he had not appealed to Caesar. Now, people have taken away from that several times. Oh, man, Paul could have survived if he just had not appealed to Caesar. And the flaw, I think, there is in thinking that Herod Agrippa was being genuine in his statement, A, and B, that even if he was being genuine, that in a different set of circumstances that he would have arrived at the same conclusion. Paul says to Festus, you know very well I'm not guilty, in verse 10, but he was still imprisoned. He knew that Felix knew that he wasn't guilty, that he was being held to gain favor with the Jews and hoped to get a bribe himself, but he remained imprisoned. So the idea that Herod Agrippa would suddenly be struck with a pang of conscience and say that Paul should be freed is a stretch for me. But whether Agrippa was genuine in what he said in chapter 26 and verse 32, whether or not what he said in 26:32 would have been true under a different set of circumstances, I think that it's preserved there for us to indicate how effective Paul was in defending himself in Acts chapter 26. Now, however that defense would have gone, it was really a spectacle because whatever Agrippa did or did not think was irrelevant because Paul's case had already been handed over to Caesar. As Festus affirms in verse 12, you have appealed to Caesar you will go. Now, this was probably something of a relief for Festus because now what happens with Paul? It's not his problem anymore. So he's in this very difficult position of trying to protect and uphold the rights and liberties of a Roman citizen while not angering the Jewish people that he had been appointed as a governor of. And who knows what kind of consequences are going to go back on him if we get a Roman citizen being assassinated, if we get a full-blown revolt, rebellion under his watch. But since Paul has appealed to Caesar, as I said, not every appeal was honored or respected. Some would have been denied, the same way that you can appeal a case to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court's not going to accept every case. I think that Festus would have done anything to get Paul off of his hands here.
I mean, is that the case? Do you know if someone appealed to Caesar and then it was determined there was nothing, the charges didn't amount to anything?
Uh-huh.
They couldn't release them at that point since they had appealed to Caesar? Is that?
So, far from being a historian myself, insofar as I know, right, once that audience is granted, that somebody appeals to go to Caesar, then it's out of their hands now. The same way that if the Supreme Court does accept a case, now whatever ruling a lower court made on it, whether in favor or against, is really irrelevant until they make their determination. So if someone is in custody and appeals to Caesar, the idea is there's good reason for them to be in custody. So if they're freed, then somebody has let Caesar's prisoner go, because now they've appealed to him. And of course, it's up to his tribunal whether or not they're released, convicted, what have you. So my understanding is that, for better or worse, once that audience to Caesar has been granted, then it's entirely up to him one way or the other. And all the lower people, the magistrates and proconsuls and governors, would not have any authority over that person's imprisonment or freedom anymore, other than getting them to Caesar. Well, there's the possible practical reason of he's experienced what the hospitality of the governor's seat has been for the last 2+ years, when Felix has kept him unjustly imprisoned, hoping to get a bribe and to earn favor with the Jews. And after having another farce of a trial where people are bringing false accusations against him that are unable to be proven, that Festus says, hey, you want to go down to Jerusalem and have another trial? So on a very practical basis, he sees, what's the expression? He's getting railroaded here in Caesarea in Jerusalem. So for a practical purpose, it would benefit him to go to Caesar, someone that is removed from the political pressures of Judea, because that's what is, I wouldn't say forcing, but influencing Festus and Felix, this tinderbox of political angst that was present in Jerusalem and in Judea. And then there's also the possible spiritual motivation, where Jesus tells him in Acts 23, in the same way that you testified in Jerusalem, you're going to testify in Rome. Now, whether Paul understood that to mean that he would testify in Rome in whatever circumstances, or that he would testify in Rome according to the same circumstances that he did in Jerusalem as a prisoner, he could have seen appealing to Caesar as a way of satisfying that directive that Jesus gave him in Acts 23. Yes, yeah, he would have been, the supreme. Like I said, he'd be like the Supreme Court for us, um, the highest authority for their law, especially at this point. This is after we have um, the the Senate in Rome is losing power, and the Caesars have become emperors. They've flirted with becoming kings a few times. So now there's much more power being centralized with Caesar or whoever occupies his seat. And so that would be, going straight to the highest courts that we have, Paul going to Caesar. Okay. Any other questions, comments? Anything anyone has? All right. So, verse 13, then, setting the stage for chapter 26. Several days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived in Caesarea and paid a courtesy call on Festus, renders the Christian Standard Bible. Since they were staying there several days, Festus presented Paul's case to the king, saying, "There's a man who is left as a prisoner by Felix. When I was in Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews presented their case and asked that he be condemned. I answered them that it is not the Roman custom to give someone up before the accused faces the accusers and has an opportunity for a defense against the charges. So when they had assembled here, I did not delay. The next day, I took my seat at the tribunal." And now this is, your translation may render this as judgment seat, even as we have in 2 Corinthians 5:10, referring to the judgment seat of Christ and elsewhere, and ordered the man to be brought in. The accusers stood up, but brought no charge against him of the evils I was expecting. Instead, they had some disagreements with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus, a dead man, Paul claimed to be alive. Since I was at a loss in a dispute over such things, I asked him if he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding these matters. But when Paul appealed to be held for trial by the emperor, I ordered him to be kept in custody until I could send him to Caesar. There's a lot of very interesting things in the way that Festus presents this to Agrippa. First of all, whose fault does he say it is?
He is talking about Felix had been doing something,
Yeah.
overseeing something.
Administration
changes
Yeah.
on his watch. What do political leaders today do?
It was the previous administration. Yep. I got this prisoner guy from Felix, right? And so, not my fault. So we see some political speak coming in here. And we also get a very frank analysis of what Felix's response is, that I heard nothing of the evils I was expecting. And we also see some of the ignorance that is the reason why Herod was put on the throne as king in Judea in the first place. So Herod and the Herods were not Jews, despite being the king of the Jews. They were Edomites. They were Idumeans. But for the Romans, close enough. And so put them on the throne. So Festus seems to be aware of some of the intricacies of the religion here, but we see that he thinks the crux of the issue, pun intended, is centered around this disagreement of religion. And the fact that he is bringing it up to Herod Agrippa seems to think that Herod Agrippa would be something of an expert on this religious matter. Now, for what it's worth, Paul uh, speaks to Agrippa much the same way that he does to the Athenians in Acts 17. Remember, in Acts 17, he's in Athens, he sees all these idols in the city, and he's provoked in his spirit, and then he goes to speak to the Athenians, and what does he say? Men of Athens, I see that you're very religious in every respect, right? So he is provoked in his spirit, and he uses this provocation as a way to compliment them. Herod Agrippa has no business being king of the Jews. Herod Agrippa is neither a king nor a Jew, right? And but he says, Paul in Acts 26:2, I consider myself fortunate that it is before you, King Agrippa, I am to make my defense today against all the accusations of the Jews, especially since you are very knowledgeable about all the Jewish customs and controversies. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. So, even though Agrippa is something of a fraud in his position, Paul is complimentary towards him. Now, it's easy to say, well, he was complimentary towards him because he was imprisoned, but he knew that he was going to Caesar. He knew that he was secure, so he wasn't dependent on Agrippa's opinion one way or the other. But we also have in Acts 17, again, him speaking to the Athenians in very much the same way, despite being free in Athens then. Okay, so back to this brief overview that Festus gives to Herod Agrippa. It's clear that he doesn't know exactly what this disagreement is about, but what three things does he know about Paul's argument, Paul's contention? What three things does he know? Who's it about? In verse 19, and said they had some disagreements with him about their own religion and about what? About Jesus, right? So he doesn't know exactly what Paul's saying. He doesn't know exactly what the Jews are saying, but he knows that Paul's talking about whom? Jesus, right? And what does he know about Jesus?
People say Jesus, Paul says he's alive.
He's a dead man, right? And what does Paul say about this man? That he's alive. So it's worth noting that he is certain about Jesus's death and says that Paul claims for him to be alive. And I think that given that Festus knew Paul for a few days at this point, there's no indication that he had any direct interaction with Paul whenever he comes to Caesarea, because one of the first things that he does after he arrives in Caesarea is to go up to Jerusalem 3 days later. And then the next day after he gets back in Jerusalem, he holds this tribunal with the Jewish leaders and with Paul. And then it's a few days after that that Agrippa and Bernice arrive in Caesarea. And then he has this conversation with Agrippa. So how many times has he seen, interacted with, spoken with, heard from Paul? Well, it could only be a handful of times, but he is able to summarize the gospel just based off of Paul's defense in these instances, that Jesus died and rose again. And that is exactly what Paul tells the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 15 the gospel is. that he died, was buried, and according to the scriptures, was resurrected 3 days later. Now, regardless of what credibility Festus places in Paul's account, he knows what Paul is saying. I wonder how often people are able to say that about us. How many interactions can we have with someone and them not know anything specific about what we believe and teach about Jesus Christ, or even if we believe and teach anything about Jesus Christ? But Paul's life was literally on the line here. And his ending in the book of Acts is very similar, but on the other end of the spectrum, to what his introduction is in the book of Acts. That in the book of Acts, he's introduced to us how? Yeah, holding the garments of those that stoned Stephen to death whenever Stephen was accused of preaching Jesus. And then he was convicted because at his defense, what did Stephen do? Yep, he prayed for them, but leading up to that, he offers his defense that I am preaching Jesus, and let me tell you about Jesus. And then Paul is in the position he's in. Felix understands it to be, right? So the Jews, the accusation that they bring in Acts 22 is that he brought a Greek man into the temple. But Festus, I said Felix a moment ago, I told y'all. That's the reason I told you at the beginning, is I get them crossed up all the time because I feel like Felix should be the nice guy and Festus should be the bad guy. But anyways, I digress. Or maybe regress, whatever. That he doesn't have any mention of the temple and the violations of the temple. He understands it to be about this central issue that about a certain Jesus, a dead man that Paul claimed to be alive. Now, the last thing I want to take away from this is, where did this come from? How did Luke come to get? This is one of the longest pieces of dialogue that we have in the book of Acts. You have, Peter in Acts 2, Gamaliel in Acts 5, Stephen in Acts 7, Paul in his various defenses here in 22 through 26. But outside of those very lengthy very lengthy parts of dialogue, these 6 or so verses is one of the longest uninterrupted pieces of dialogue that we have in the book of Acts. So the fact that it is so long and is detailed is very intriguing as to how Luke got this. Very often we find that his accounts are most specific whenever we're in the we sections of the book of Acts. So at times Luke will say he, Paul, they, and at times he'll say we went such and such place, which implies, if not outright telling us, that Luke was a part of the party, a part of the group at those times. So was he directly privy to this conversation for one reason or another? Was it relayed to him directly after the fact, or is it only by divine revelation that he has this extended bit of dialogue? It's an intriguing question, one that I don't think we have very many explicit answers for, but it seems to me, so my opinion and not a whole lot else, that Luke had some kind of inside source here. Because even going back to the letter that Lysias writes to Felix whenever Paul is first sent to Caesarea, that he has the full text as if he transcribed that letter over to his own letter to Theophilus. So it seems like either Luke himself or someone that was firsthand for these events was a source for Luke, which I think is one of the times reading between the lines that we can see the kind of impression and how effective Paul was at reaching and influencing people. Uh, Tradition essentially convicted and was about to be executed by being beheaded, that his jailer that had been overseeing his house arrest offered his head in the place of Paul. Now, being tradition, that's probably about as meritorious as my opinion is, so take it for what you will. But one way or the other, it is apparent that Paul made an impression on people. We don't see anyone in the book of Acts that has a lukewarm opinion of Paul. There's nobody that says, Paul, he's a nice guy. I could take him or leave him, right? There are people that were weeping, begging Paul not to go whenever he was separating from the elders of the church in Ephesus. And we have the Jews in their rabid determination to kill Paul, whether he's in the custody of the Romans or not. All right, so verse 22, Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow you will hear him. Festus replies to him. That verse didn't take long. Okay. Which one? The preacher said I can have some of his time. So, all right. Any closing questions, comments? Anything anyone has? All right. Well, Andy will pick up next week in Acts chapter 25 and verse 23. And I'll be excited to get back to you and return to our study of the book of Acts. All right. If no one has anything else, thank you all so much for your attention and participation. And the invitation song was number 316. Number 316. Number 316. James offers what is, this is the biblical author James, not the James we have with us, although I am certain that he has a great deal of wisdom to offer to us. But James offers some wisdom that is especially beneficial to us, and perhaps very beneficial to myself, and that is regarding the use and the control of our tongues. Thought I would shift, having only a few minutes here, and he reminds us that the anger of men doesn't work the righteousness of God. And the antithesis to the anger of God is to be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. In James chapter 1 and verse 26, he says, if anyone thinks he is religious without controlling his tongue, his religion is useless, and he deceives himself. Not always very good at stopping talking, although I do try. But you've known me long enough now to give a hearty amen to that. But there are some things that we always find ourselves having a hard time to bring ourselves to a close on. But we should be mindful that controlling our tongues reflects the way that we control ourselves. And the way that we control ourselves is directly related to the way that we are practicing our religion before the Father. If you're here this evening and have ineffectively controlled yourself, your tongue, or any part of you, and need to be restored to the body of Christ, or if you've never put Christ on in baptism, this invitation is for you. If you are here and need the love, care, support of your brethren in whatever way we can provide, we're desperate to be able to do so, and ask only that you make yourself known in whatever way is comfortable for you as we stand and as we sing.